John Prine is a father. He has a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old. He's a husband, and he is a superb computer programmer. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't know all that much about computers. I can Google, and I can use Microsoft Word. But there's one key on the computer that I'm pretty sure we're all familiar with, and that's the delete button. If you make a mistake, if you type something wrong, if you see something on the screen that you just don't like, all you have to do is put your finger on that button, press down, and poof, your problem goes away. Well, that's what we have here. Anthony Wright, John Prine's father-in-law, and the police, seeing John Prine as their problem and trying to delete him. We can't let them do it. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, as you know, my name is James McGraw, and I represent John Prine. The burden is with the prosecution. That means that they have to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that John Prine committed the charges that have been brought against him. Let me say that again. They have to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt. That doesn't mean that you just have to think that he maybe committed the crimes or that he probably committed the crimes. It means that you have to be sure. You have to be confident. You have to know without hesitation. Otherwise, you have no other choice but to find John Prine not guilty. And I believe you will. First, I just want to talk about the story of what really happened and who really had motives here. And second, I want to review the charges that the prosecution has brought against John Prine so that we can realize just how empty they really are. And after we do those two things, you will have your finger on the delete button. And you'll have the opportunity to decide what really is the mistake here. In this case, it's important to understand who really had motives and what really happened. Anthony Wright is John Prine's father-in-law. They don't really have a great relationship. In-laws not getting along. What a surprise. But this goes beyond what most of us are really used to. As we heard from Katie Moss, it's not uncommon for Anthony Wright to hurl insults, including curse words, at his son-in-law. But what is perhaps most surprising is that Anthony Wright said to John Prine, "I will bury you, and you will never see it coming." Let me say that again. Anthony Wright said to his son-in-law, the father of his grandchildren, "I will bury you, and you will never see it coming." That doesn't sound like family talk. That sounds like motive. That sounds like an agenda. An agenda that Anthony Wright carried out. Now I want to talk about the date that John Prine was actually arrested. The police saw him rolling through a stop sign. Not such an uncommon thing in North Philadelphia when it's dark out. But the police weren't just waiting on that corner and happened to catch John Prine roll through the stop sign. No. They had been following him until he did that, because they had received an anonymous tip to follow this car with John Prine in it. But the source couldn't have been quite so anonymous, because what's interesting is that John Prine was driving his wife, Bonnie Prine's car. Who would know that? Well, Anthony Wright would, because that car had been parked at his house because the Prine family was living with him. Anthony Wright knew that John Prine was driving that car to work that day. And Anthony Wright would have had the ability to call the police and tip them off to follow John Prine. But let's get back to the actual arrest. After following him, waiting for John Prine to make a mistake, Officer Defoe pulled John Prine over and pulled him over for rolling through a stop sign. But then he claimed that he smelled alcohol on John Prine's breath. Now, that's actually very significant, because after rolling through a stop sign, Officer Defoe wouldn't have the ability to search the car. But if we were talking about a DUI, now Officer Defoe does have the right to search the car. So even though John Prine denied that he had been drinking, Officer Defoe then went into the car and found some cocaine, not on John Prine, but in between the passenger seat and the center console, and then a firearm underneath the back seat, beyond Mr. Prine's reach. After that, John Prine, along with that evidence, was taken back to the police station. Detective Clooney spoke with John Prine, but what's more interesting is what he didn't do, which was he didn't order DNA testing of the cocaine that was found or the firearm. DNA testing that would have shown, perhaps, that John Prine had touched the firearm, the cocaine, and therefore possessed it and knew about it. But also that perhaps would have shown that John Prine had nothing to do with those things at all. And why wouldn't Detective Clooney run that DNA test? Well, why would he want to? They received an anonymous tip. They followed the car waiting for there to be a mistake made. Once John Prine rolled through a stop sign, he was pulled over. At that point, the police officer, despite John Prine's own statements, believed that John Prine had been drinking. At that point, he was able to search the car, and then he found cocaine and a firearm. The police had their man. They had been looking for a reason to pull John Prine over. They had been looking for a reason to bring him in, and they had been given that reason. They had been able to carry out exactly what Anthony Raitt wanted all along: a chance to bury John Prine. It's also important that we examine the charges and just how empty they really are. The first charge against John Prine is possession of cocaine with intent to distribute it. Now, I just want to remind you, the prosecution has to prove that he did that beyond a reasonable doubt. But they can't do that. Now, there's two elements that they have to show. First, that he possessed the cocaine, and second, that he had an intent to distribute it. Let's deal with the first part, that he possessed the cocaine. Now, as we pointed out, the cocaine was not on John Prine. It wasn't in his pocket. It wasn't on the driver's seat. It was wedged in between the console and the passenger seat. But it's also important to realize that because we didn't get DNA evidence, there's no fingerprints, there's no DNA that shows John Prine had ever touched it, that he would have put it there. Nothing. Nothing whatsoever. What we do know, though, is that John Prine wasn't driving his car. He was driving his wife's car. And what we also know, as we heard from John Prine in his statement to the police, and then later from Katie Moss, was that his wife and her friends may have a history of using cocaine. John Prine has no cocaine record, but his wife, as we've heard, does. History for Bonnie Prine: Bonnie Prine's car, no DNA evidence showing John Prine had any knowledge or contact with the drugs. If anything, it seems like we know who the person is that's responsible and possessed the cocaine. But that person is not John Prine. The second element is an intent to distribute. Now, the police did not catch John Prine handing out the cocaine or making any kind of deals or sales of cocaine. Instead, they had a narcotics expert come up here and speak to you and say that they think that he probably was going to distribute it because all of the cocaine was broken up into small little dime bags, which is consistent with the sale of cocaine. But they don't really take that the next step, which is that also means that would be consistent with what a person who was buying cocaine would have. And if you were buying a lot of cocaine, you wouldn't be able to buy just one big bag of cocaine. No. Because if you went to the people that were selling drugs, they would have had to sell you a whole variety of dime bags. Because according to the narcotics expert, that's how they're broken up. So it makes total sense that there would be plenty of dime bags, but not because John Prine was distributing it, but because whoever bought it, Bonnie Prine, would have needed several bags. And if she was going to use it for herself and a whole host of her friends, it would also make sense to have it divided up anyway, because that would have made it easier to enjoy yourself by being able to hand out different bags. But furthermore, we need to realize that if John Prine was going to distribute cocaine, don't you think he would have had the gun on him? If you're going to a corner and you're going to make a sale, you were really worried about your safety in North Philadelphia. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't put the gun in the back seat, because this is what would happen. If somebody came up towards me and there was a discussion and there was an argument and I needed to defend myself, this person that right now is right up in my face, I would now have to get up, undo my seatbelt, climb into the back, reach in, find the gun under the back seat, turn around, get it back up, and then point the gun at them and fire. At that point, the gun will have been doing me no good whatsoever. If he was going to distribute cocaine, I'm pretty sure he would have had the protection. He would have had protection on him, not underneath some McDonald's wrappers under the back seat. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, it just doesn't make sense that he had any intent to distribute it. Instead, it is much more plausible that Bonnie Prine, getting ready to have fun with her friends, had purchased several dime bags of cocaine to get ready for an upcoming party. But I also want to focus again on the possession of that firearm that we were just talking about under the back seat. That's the second charge that the prosecution has brought against John Prine. Again, they have to prove possession of a firearm beyond a reasonable doubt. They can't leave you with any questions. You have to know that he is guilty of that crime. There's two elements that they have to prove and that they have to prove. First is that he possessed the firearm, and the second is that he possessed the firearm after having been convicted of a crime that is punishable with a sentence exceeding a 1-year term. Now let's deal with the second part first, the past offense. We've already agreed that he does have a past history. He has a past history of selling heroin 4 years ago. That's all that can be used for. That past crime, as the judge has instructed you, can only be used to show that, yes, in the past he has a conviction, and so it meets this element of this charge. Just one of the two elements. It cannot be used to show that he'd be likely to have drugs or distribute drugs. And we have to realize that that's really all it is, though. It's history. It's something that happened 4 years ago. We had his boss on the stand, and Bill Gates told us that he's a superb worker, a superb employee. He does a great job. And when Bill Gates was told, would it change your opinion if you knew that 4 years ago he had been convicted of that crime? He said no. And that's because John Prine is a different person. He's not the kind of person that would distribute cocaine now. He's not the kind of person that would possess a firearm when he's not allowed to now. He's changed. So yes, he does meet this element of having a past conviction, but that's all that past conviction means. But I also want to deal with the possession of the firearm. We have no DNA evidence whatsoever that he possessed the firearm. Instead, we just know that the firearm matches that of what a police officer would have. A police officer like his father-in-law, who would have been by the car that was parked at his house and who would have owned that type of gun. We could know more if there had been proper DNA evidence. But as we heard, that was too much of a cost. A cost for the prosecution. It was not too much of a cost for the life of this man, for the freedom of John Prine. Unfortunately, they decided that a few dollars saved is worth more than a life preserved. Ladies and gentlemen, it is clear that the prosecution has failed to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. They failed to prove their case at all. We saw this first by reviewing the motives involved in this case and the story of what really happened. Then we examined the charges for themselves. And we saw that they can't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that John Prine possessed the cocaine or that he had an intent to distribute it. And they can't show beyond a reasonable doubt that he possessed a firearm either. John Prine is a computer programmer. John Prine is no longer a criminal. It's important for you to understand that now that you have your finger on the delete button. But I ask you, don't delete John Prine. Please, delete his nightmare.